Hey everyone! Tonight we're stepping into something a little less scholarly and a lot more herbal. A hazy fragrant journey through the curious world of medieval intoxication. Yes, people in the Middle Ages definitely indulged, but as you'll soon see, their methods were often strange, sometimes risky, and occasionally quite inventive. Before we dive in, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy the kind of stories we share here. And in the comments, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing where our sleepy little community stretches across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that gentle background vibe, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When you imagine a medieval monastery, you might think of stone cloisters, endless prayers, and pale-robed monks tending to sheep or copying scriptures by candlelight. But not many consider what grew behind the walls, quietly tended in the shadowed plots of the herbal gardens, while the outer world suffered through plagues, famines, and warfare. Monastic gardens were quietly blooming with peculiar herbs, some of which had strange effects not entirely explained by scripture or medicine. This is where our journey begins, with a simple garden, its soil rich with mystery, and the old hands that knew exactly how to draw dreams from leaves. Medieval apothecaries were not like the clean, antiseptic pharmacists of today. They were closer to gardeners, mystics, and sometimes even chemists in robes. In the Benedictine and Cistercian traditions, monks were often the only ones literate enough to read the ancient herbals books, passed down from Roman or even Greek sources, sometimes copied from Arabic texts with meticulous care. Within these faded pages were records of roots that could relieve pain, leaves that brought on visions, and powders that could turn a waking man into a sleeping dreamer. One of the most common, hallucinogenic plants in a monastery garden was mandrake. Its root, shaped like a human figure, was believed to scream when pulled from the ground. That myth was so persistent that some monks tied dogs to the roots and had them do the pulling, hoping to avoid the imagined fatal cry. The real effect, however, came after drying the root and preparing it into potions or poultices. Used in tiny amounts, it served as a powerful sedative or painkiller. But take too much, and one might see angels dancing in the rafters, or perhaps demons laughing in the corners of their eyes. Next to mandrake was henbane, a plant with pale yellow flowers and a bitter odor. This plant could be used to treat toothaches or induce sleep, but it also caused dry mouth, blurred vision, and wild hallucinations. Historical records suggest that monks occasionally used it in rituals, especially when caring for the sick or dying, but there is some suspicion found in the marginal notes of certain herbals that henbane was sometimes used recreationally, or at least, with curiosity, brings forth visions of wonder. One 13th century monk scribbled beside an illustration of the plant. Belladonna, or deadly nightshade, was even more dangerous. Its berries were fatally toxic in high doses, but when carefully measured and distilled, it could dull pain and cause a kind of trance. Women in some regions used small drops in their eyes to dilate the pupils, hence the name belladonna, or beautiful lady. In the monastery, belladonna was used sparingly, mostly for surgical procedures or in rare treatments for mania or insomnia. But again, the line between medicine and mysticism was often blurred. While we tend to imagine monks as strict and pious, they lived in a world filled with contradiction. They copied sacred texts and recipes for wine in the same breath. They avoided sin and temptation, while tending plants that could send a man into ecstasy or madness. And in their apothecaries, often low-ceilinged stone rooms filled with dried herbs, animal bones, and glass flasks, they experimented with these substances in ways that were equal parts scientific and spiritual. There is one curious entry in the Herbarium Opuli, a Latin manuscript widely copied across monasteries that hints at something stranger. To speak with the divine, it reads, steep the root of mandragora with wine, and take it upon the waning moon. Was this poetic metaphor? Or had certain monks actually found a way to induce what they believed were visions of God through carefully measured intoxication? You must also consider the social and political protection that monasteries enjoyed. Unlike the average peasant or even noble, monks were largely shielded from interference. Their experiments with herbs, spiritual or otherwise, went unnoticed by the outside world. When a monk claimed to have visions after a long fast or spiritual awakening, no one questioned whether he had taken something beforehand. In fact, visions were considered signs of closeness to the divine, not something to be investigated with suspicion. The idea of using plants to reach altered states wasn't new to Christianity either. Older pagan traditions, particularly Celtic and Germanic rites, relied heavily on hallucinogens in ritual. It is likely that some of this knowledge was preserved, even if buried under layers of piety and Latin verses. Certain monasteries in what is now Germany and northern France recorded recipes with ingredients that included sleeping milk and dreaming wine, euphemisms for concoctions likely laced with psychoactive plants. Even Saint Hildegard of Bingen, one of the most respected abbesses of the 12th century, wrote about the spiritual uses of plants. Her visions, recounted in vivid detail, are some of the most striking in medieval Christian mysticism. While Hildegard never confessed to taking any hallucinogens, some modern scholars suggest that her intense migraines, combined with herbal treatments of the time, may have induced trance-like states that she interpreted as divine. So what exactly did a monk experience in such a state? The surviving texts are vague, often couched in religious language. The spirit lifted and danced with fire, one brother wrote. Voices in the stone, light that spoke to me of mercy, wrote another. While poetic, these suggest inner experiences far removed from typical daily meditation or prayer. Could it be that behind the stone walls and whispered chants, there was a hidden world of psychedelic exploration masked as religious devotion? To be clear, this wasn't recreational drug use in the modern sense. There were no joints passed around under tapestries, no flasks filled with hallucinogenic brews for fun. Everything was cloaked in sacred purpose, often justified through healing, divine communion, or preparation for death. But that line between medicine and mysticism, healing and getting high, was thin, and often walked without much awareness of its consequences. And what of the dangers? There are records of monks falling ill or dying after consuming incorrectly prepared herbs. Belladonna, in particular, had a narrow window between helpful and fatal. One poor novice reportedly collapsed into fever and madness after confusing two similarly shaped roots. Others suffered lasting tremors or bouts of temporary blindness. Yet the knowledge continued to pass, often through whispered mentorships, from old hands to young novices. These gardens behind cloisters were never just for roses and thyme. They were places of power and risk, sanctuaries of sacred knowledge. Among the kale and cabbage grew keys to other worlds, if one knew how to use them. But that leads us to wonder who decided which visions were divine and which were delusion, and how much of what we call faith was stirred by the leaves in a monk's wooden bowl. So much of what we understand about medieval monastic life is filtered through an image of unshakable piety, rows of silent monks, each cloaked in wool and duty, hands folded in prayer, minds fixed on salvation. But behind the locked doors of the Apothecary, and within the herbal garden's sacred stillness, something more complex and, perhaps more unsettling, was quietly unfolding. The early monks were not only seekers of divine order, they were custodians of a deeper, botanical knowledge. In their endless pursuit of purity and understanding, some wandered further inward than they might have realized. And the cost of this quiet experimentation could be steep. The records we have from this time are fractured scraps of manuscripts, marginal notes, and entries in herbals that were half medical, half mystical. In some of these, we begin to see signs of experiences that today we would call altered states of consciousness. There were no clinical terms then for hallucinations, nor were there sharp distinctions between physical and spiritual suffering. To experience visions was often interpreted as divine favor or dangerous temptation. At the Abbey of St. Gall, high in the alpine foothills of present-day Switzerland, a monk named Bernard left behind a curious trail of writings. Bernard, trained in the herb lore of the abbey's vast gardens, wrote several small commentaries in the margins of a worn herbal codex. One entry beside a description of datura potent and dangerously hallucinogenic plant reads simply, "It opens the sky when the spirit is pure." It is a cryptic remark, but not unique. Other monks used similar language when describing their use of certain herbs. The veil is thinned, angels nearer, the light sings. Of course, not all visions were pleasant. Henbane and belladonna, especially when mismeasured, were known to bring on what some monks called the fire within the head, a term we now might associate with delirium or psychotic episodes. A monk in a Welsh priory reportedly fell into convulsions after drinking too strong a dose of sleeping cordial during Lent. His recovery took weeks, during which time he muttered fragments of scripture in reverse and stared unblinking at corners of his cell. Afterward, he claimed to have spoken with a flaming angel who warned him of impending heresies in Christendom. This event was recorded and quietly passed to Rome not as heresy or hallucination, but as divine prophecy. Yet, not all were so lucky. The border between mystic insight and permanent madness was fragile. In one French Cistercian abbey, a promising young brother trained for years in the sacred garden was found wandering barefoot and naked through the cloisters, covered in earth, his eyes wide and unfocused. The herbs he had taken were meant to ease the pain of fasting. Instead, they pulled him into some unreachable part of himself. He was confined to his cell for the remainder of his life. His writings were preserved but never publicly copied. Despite such risks, the experiments continued. Why? Because monks believed they were unlocking doors to deeper understanding. Just as fasting, flagellation, and isolation were seen as methods to bring the soul closer to the divine, so too were these botanical journeys. The concept of sacred suffering was deeply embedded in medieval Christianity. A man who suffered greatly and endured visions especially painful or frightening ones was often believed to have reached a higher level of sanctity. This was especially true for anchorites and mystics, those who lived in near-complete solitude and sought union with God through extreme denial of the body. Julian of Norwich, while not a monk herself, had visions during a severe illness that were later canonized as divine revelations. Though she did not attribute her experience to herbs, it is worth noting that similar intense visions were often linked to both physical suffering and treatments involving psychoactive plants. And here lies the uncomfortable truth. Many medieval religious experiences may have been chemically induced intentionally, or not. A tincture prepared by a monk for a dying man might contain opium, mandrake, or henbane as the body slipped into its final hours. The mind might encounter visions of heaven or hell, not necessarily through divine intervention, but through the interaction of dying neurons and psychoactive compounds. The monks, observing this, took it as a sign that their spiritual preparation was working. The experience was passed along as testimony, beyond healing. Monks also believed certain plants enhanced prayer. Some recipes call for herbs to be burned in censers, not just for smell or ritual, but for spiritual clarity. Frankincense and myrrh were common, but so were native resins and smokes, whose properties were less benign. Burning a bit of henbane, or even wild cannabis in a tightly enclosed chapel could cause dizziness, warmth, and strange thoughts, explained as the Holy Spirit moving within the worshipper. Yet outside the monastery walls, such behavior would be viewed quite differently. In village life, similar herbs were associated with witches, herbalists, and cunning folk. A peasant woman found cultivating belladonna might be burned or drowned. A hedge doctor using mandrake to treat fever could be accused of summoning spirits. The same actions that earned a monk praise or curiosity behind the abbey gates could condemn a layperson to death in the local courts. This was the quiet privilege of the educated and cloistered. They could explore the very edges of sanity and faith without fear of persecution, as long as they wore the right robes. One of the strangest cases comes from a poorly preserved manuscript found in a Hungarian abbey. It describes a ritual called Oratio de Visu, Seely the prayer for the sight of heaven. The document is damaged, but it outlines a process in which a monk fasts for 3 days, is anointed with oil infused with henbane and mandrake, and then breathes in the steam from a simmering herbal broth. The brother is then placed in a quiet stone chamber, alone, to wait. The goal was not healing, but revelation. The ritual is recorded only once, and there is no record of the monk's experience. But the mere existence of such a detailed rite suggests an organized attempt to create a divine hallucination. Modern historians argue about how widespread these practices were. Some believe they were isolated, the eccentric indulgences of a few curious monks. Others believe they were more common, but shrouded in spiritual language that obscured their true nature. And there is always the possibility that some of these monks truly believed the herbs merely facilitated what God already wanted to reveal. They were not getting high in the way we understand it. They were, in their minds, opening their souls to a greater truth. What we know for certain is that knowledge of these herbs was carefully guarded. Apprentice monks were slowly initiated into the apothecary's secrets, their hands trained to measure by weight and instinct, their eyes taught to spot rot or mold, their senses sharpened to know when a brew was too strong. Recipes were passed down orally or in heavily coded texts. One such document, the Herba Mundi, includes symbols and riddles rather than names of herbs. 3 drops from the root that sleeps by moonlight. One passage reads, "Only the trained knew what it meant." This secrecy was both protection and necessity. If the knowledge leaked to outsiders, it could be misunderstood, misused, or condemned. And even within the abbey, not all monks were comfortable with the implications. Some feared that these practices bordered too closely on sorcery. A few abbots outlawed the use of certain plants altogether, but in quieter corners of Europe, in stone-walled herb rooms lined with jars and dried bundles, the experiments continued. What remains today are scattered closing-stained fingers, faded manuscripts, silent gardens, still growing descendants of those old herbs, and the unanswerable question that floats through monastic history like incense: were these visions truly divine, or simply the mind's reaction to carefully brewed chemicals? By the time the late 14th century rolled around, the monastic world had already begun to change. The Black Death had swept across Europe, and with it came questions no herb, no smoke, no whispered Latin chant could answer. Thousands of monks died alongside the laity, their once revered spiritual status offering no protection against the plague's indifferent march. The apothecaries, too, fell silent. Shelves of powdered mandrake, dried henbane, and resinous roots remained untouched, as brothers buried brothers in haste and prayer. Still, for a time, the memory of the plants and their secrets lingered in darkened corners of monasteries. The knowledge did not vanish overnight. In some abbeys, particularly in remote parts of Ireland, Spain, and the Baltic regions, the apothecary tradition continued with little interruption. Monks there quietly maintained their gardens, recording their results in obscure dialects and marginalia that modern scholars are still trying to piece together. But as the Renaissance approached, and medicine began to separate more sharply from mysticism, the space for sacred hallucination narrowed. Slowly, the monastic embrace of herb-induced visions was edged out by academic scrutiny. What had once been framed as holy insight began to look more like medical delirium. The intellectual elite of Florence and Paris started referring to phantasmata visions, not sent by God, but born of imbalanced humors or diseased minds. The study of herbs continued, but now through the lens of anatomy and alchemy, not divine revelation. Galenic medicine and Arabic pharmacology replaced the old mystic herbal manuals. The visionary monk became a relic, a subject of curiosity, or even suspicion. In some places, the shift was harsher. As heresy trials became more widespread, especially under the growing power of the Inquisition, any suggestion of visionary ecstasy triggered by outside agents, plants, fumes, tinctures, was treated with suspicion. To claim one had seen angels after sipping a root broth was no longer evidence of holiness but of error, or worse, consorting with unclean forces. Herbalists outside of monastic walls were targeted first, especially women, whose inherited folk knowledge was now painted with the brush of witchcraft. But even within monasteries, the apothecaries came under watch. Inventories were scrutinized. Some herbals were edited, or simply lost. One particularly revealing case occurred at the Abbey of Cluny in the late 1400s. A monk named Father Martin had grown famous for his anointing oils, which he claimed brought peace to the dying and clarity to the confused. After a visiting bishop fell ill and experienced dreams of unholy grandeur, suspicion turned to Father Martin's concoctions. An inquiry revealed that his recipes included extracts of datura, poppy resin, and possibly fly agaric mushroom substances, potent enough to bring on hours of disorientation and vivid hallucinations. The monk was defrocked and confined to a small outbuilding where he died not long after. His scrolls were burned. The garden he had so carefully tended was pulled up and sown with barley. It was an end not just to a man, but to a tradition. After this period, very few monastic records mention the kinds of visionary herbs we've explored. Medical texts still catalog them, but without the spiritual gloss. Mandrake was now seen as dangerous and unpredictable. Henbane as deadly. Belladonna, even when useful, was labeled with heavy warnings. The practice of using herbs for spiritual ascent or descent quietly retreated into the shadows. Some of it survived in the folk practices of rural Europe, tucked away in the songs and recipes of hedge healers and midwives. But its association with monastic life had ended. Today, when we look at old herbals or walk through reconstructed monastery gardens, we rarely think of visions. We see chamomile for sleep, mint for digestion, rosemary for memory. The more dangerous plants are often left out, or placed behind small signs that warn of their toxicity. But in the scratched and faded ink of old manuscripts, the ghost of that knowledge lingers. The monks who once brewed vision into wine or laced prayer with smoke have vanished, but their thoughts still echo. Modern historians and ethnobotanists are slowly piecing together this lost world. A few scholars now believe that medieval monasticism preserved not just theological tradition, but an experimental approach to altered consciousness. In recent decades, the intersection of religion and psychedelics has once again drawn attention. Researchers have noted uncanny parallels between the experiences induced by substances, like psilocybin or ayahuasca, and the visions described in medieval religious texts. The swirling lights, feelings of divine unity. Voices from beyond these are not new experiences, only newly re-examined. Of course, it's impossible to know for certain how much the monks understood what they were doing. Did they know the chemical effects of their plants? Did they connect a vision of an angel with a particular herb, or with the fasting and solitude that accompanied its use? Did they question whether God or garden was responsible? Or did they, in the deepest simplicity, believe both were one and the same? Perhaps that's the most enduring lesson. For these monks, the garden was never just a source of medicine. It was a space of mystery and of risk. A holy place where life, death, and the divine all brushed against the same leaves. Where a careful hand could draw forth not just healing, but something closer to the sacred unknown. In the quiet of night, in a stone cell with a candle burning low, a monk might sip a small cup of dreaming cordial and lie back on his straw mattress. His eyes would close, and somewhere beyond the weight of his robe and the stillness of the cloister, he might find himself walking through blazing gardens, through music and fire and stars arranged in shapes never seen by the waking world. And in that journey, silent, trembling, holy, he would believe himself to be near to God. And now, centuries later, as we reconstruct these fragments of forgotten insight, we are left with a final thought to ponder. Was the monastery garden a place of prayer, or a gate to something far more unknowable? To the modern mind, beer is a comfort drink, reliable, familiar, and thoroughly secular. But in medieval Europe, brewing was anything but casual. It was an act of preservation, purification, and, in many cases, divine duty. And yet beneath this sober surface was something unexpected. The daily drink of monks and commoners alike often carried mind-altering properties that reached beyond the simple buzz of alcohol. These brews, some made with herbs far more potent than barley or hops, not only softened the bleakness of medieval life, but sometimes crossed the line into hallucinogenic territory. This is the forgotten story of how people intentionally or not got high from their ale. The early medieval world faced a dangerous dilemma. Water could not be trusted. Most sources were tainted with animal waste, sewage, or industrial runoff, especially in towns. This made beer, and to a lesser degree, wine, safer choices for daily consumption. But this wasn't the crisp, filtered lager of today. Medieval beer was cloudy, inconsistent, often sour, and loaded with whatever the brewer had on hand. It was common to drink small beer, a weak brew with low alcohol content, throughout the day, even for children. And it wasn't unusual to consume multiple pints over the course of a working day, sometimes beginning at dawn. But the real intrigue lies in how beer was flavored and preserved. Before hops became standard, brewers used an herbal mixture called grute. Grute could include a wide variety of botanicals: bog myrtle, yarrow, horehound, juniper, rosemary, and wild rosemary, ledum, palustre among them. Some of these herbs were mildly psychoactive. Others were stronger. Wild rosemary, for instance, was known to cause euphoria, confusion, or even delirium in high doses. The result, depending on the recipe, a pint of ale might do more than quench your thirst. It might alter your perception of reality. Brewing in monasteries was especially influential. Many monastic orders, particularly the Benedictines and later the Trappists, became renowned for their beer. It was a major source of sustenance, especially during fasting periods. Monks believed that beer, being liquid, didn't violate fasting rules. The richer and more nourishing the brew, the better it served the body during spiritual deprivation. But richer also meant stronger and, sometimes, stranger. One chronicle from a Bavarian monastery in the 12th century recounts a period when the brothers experienced visions of light and the sweet laughter of the divine after consuming a particularly potent batch of ale. The brewmaster, an elderly monk named Brother Anselm, had experimented with an old grute recipe that included dried henbane and mugwort. The batch was strong, dark, and unusually heady. Some monks claimed to feel transported during evening prayer. Others reported dreams that bled into daylight, while the abbey later reverted to simpler brews. The story lived on in whispered jokes and hymnal marginalia. Mugwort, in particular, had a long association with altered states. Used in both medicine and pagan ritual, it was known to induce vivid dreams when consumed or burned. It appeared in many early brewing manuals, often without dosage recommendations. Combined with alcohol, its effects were magnified. Peasants, who drank mugwort-infused ale after a hard day's work, might drift into sleep filled with strange symbols and whispered songs. Most thought nothing of it. It was simply the way ale worked. Then came absinthe's early cousins, not the clear, green elixir of 19th century Paris, but bitter herbal spirits made from wormwood and anise-like plants. While true absinthe as we know it didn't appear until much later, the precursors were already in circulation by the 13th century. Apothecaries in Italy and southern France produced strong wormwood wines, sometimes served during feast days or to treat indigestion. But wormwood contains thujan, a compound that, in high doses, can be neurotoxic and potentially hallucinogenic. Repeated consumption of such infusions, especially in stronger alcoholic mediums, could bring on symptoms of confusion, tremors, and visions. For a peasant or monk unfamiliar with chemistry, it might well have felt like a spiritual experience. It's also worth noting that many medieval brewing methods were inconsistent. Without thermometers or standardized yeast strains, each batch of beer was a unique gamble. Temperature, humidity, the type of vessel all influenced the final product. Wild yeasts and bacteria often crept in, some of which produced psychoactive one such microorganism, Claviceps purpurea, better known as ergot, occasionally contaminated rye and other grains. Ergot contains alkaloids similar to LSD, while ergot poisoning is more famously associated with deadly outbreaks and gangrene. In small doses, it could cause hallucinations, tremors, and convulsions. A badly stored sack of grain, used unknowingly in beer making, could turn a peaceful village gathering into a night of collective visions or seizures. But beer wasn't just a physical remedy, it was cultural medicine. The tavern and alehouse served as the community's hearth, a place to escape the raw edge of survival. Life was hard, cold, and brief. A pint or three of something warming and strange made the wait a little easier to bear. The beer buzz was expected. The visions, perhaps, were part of the price. As time wore on, the church began to regulate monastic brewing more strictly. In 1516, the Reinheitsgebot, the German beer purity law, declared that beer could only be made with water, barley, and hops. Though it applied primarily to Bavaria, it had a rippling influence. Hops, long known for their calming but non-psychoactive effect, slowly replaced Grut throughout Europe. Brewing became safer, cleaner, and blander. The sharp edge of herbal intoxication was dulled. Still, remnants of the old ways persisted. In remote parts of Scotland and Scandinavia, farmhouse brews retained their herbal chaos well into the 17th century. Recipes were handed down in families and monasteries alike, often in song or symbol. One Danish record speaks of a dreamer's ale prepared only for weddings and funerals, its ingredients guarded with near-religious secrecy. Today, when historians examine these fragments' ingredient lists, brewing logs, and personal journals, they begin to see a different picture of medieval life. Not just hard and joyless, but filled with moments of otherworldly escape. Perhaps not every pint led to visions, but many medieval drinkers were, quite literally, drinking in the divine, or at least a convincing echo of it. So next time you think of a medieval monk lifting a wooden mug of ale to his lips in some dim, echoing hall, remember what, exactly, was in that cup, and how much of what they saw was real. By the dawn of the 13th century, brewing in monasteries had matured into an essential economic and spiritual practice. Alehouses were attached to abbeys. Traveling pilgrims found both shelter and strong drink. The monks not only controlled production, but also the knowledge behind it, the selection of herbs, the strength of fermentation, and, more importantly, the line between spiritual clarity and mind-numbing delirium. This power gave them an invisible authority. They were not just keepers of prayer, but gatekeepers to altered experience. The concept of measured intoxication emerged among these circles. Drinking to the point of gentle inebriation was not only tolerated, it was encouraged in many beer, when consumed in moderation, was seen as a gift from God. Monks differentiated between inebriatio gravis, heavy drunkenness, and inebriatio spiritualis, a term found in some theological discussions. referring to the elated state that supposedly made prayer deeper and more sincere. While not all orders embraced this view, it echoed quietly through many cloisters, especially those with robust brewing traditions. But how did monks manage the effects of stronger brews and psychoactive groots without falling into chaos? The answer lies in discipline. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governed much of monastic life, emphasized moderation in all things. Meals were measured, speech was restricted, and behavior was codified. Even when beer was consumed several times a day, the act was bound by ritual. Drinking was done in silence or accompanied by prayer. One's mind, it was believed, could be uplifted without losing self-control. Yet not every monk succeeded in walking this fine line. The writings of Brother Theodoric of Reims provide a rare first-hand account of failure. He described his time at the Abbey of St. Farron, where he served as an apprentice in the brewery. In one surviving letter to a fellow monk, Theodoric recounted a batch of ale that had been improperly gruted with wild rosemary and juniper berries. He drank heavily after evening vespers and described a strange spinning of the chapel walls, and an angel made of stained glass that walked toward him. His hallucination lasted several hours, during which he wandered barefoot through the choir and was later found weeping beside the scriptorium fire. Afterward, he was punished not for drinking, but for breaking silence and disrupting prayer. The incident, while hushed publicly, served as a warning. Such episodes led some monastic leaders to distance themselves from group brewing altogether. One Cistercian abbot even issued a prohibition. Let no bitter herb be added to ale, save hops, and in measure. This marks an early pivot toward hops becoming the standard. Hops not only preserved the beer but also acted as a sedative, calming, rather than exciting, the drinker. Unlike root herbs, which could have unpredictable effects, hops dulled anxiety and aided sleep. Their growing popularity marked a turning point in brewing history, where safety and consistency were prized over ecstatic possibilities. Still, not all regions transitioned at the same pace. In England and parts of the Low Countries, Groot held on longer. Groot rights' legal monopolies on the sale of brewing herbs were tightly controlled by ecclesiastical and noble powers. These rights generated income and sustained entire communities. Brewing with Groot was not just culinary, it was economic and political. Monasteries that owned Groot rights effectively controlled the town's drinking habits. In these areas, monks experimented carefully with blends. Some added only tiny pinches of psychoactive herbs to create subtle effects. Others created specialized brews for feast days or saints' festivals. Strong, rich ales laced with yarrow or mugwort, believed to thin the veil between this world and the next. Pilgrims who arrived at these abbeys during festivals would sometimes speak of strange sleep or divine warmth, especially after a few cups. No one openly called it hallucination. It was the spirit moving through celebration. There's evidence that some monks even used psychoactive brews during nighttime prayer vigils. These were long, cold, often exhausting rituals that stretched into the early hours. A cup of wakeful ale, containing stimulating herbs like horehound and juniper, was believed to sharpen the senses. But in high doses, such brews could also bring confusion and dreamlike thoughts. A manuscript from an abbey near Ghent describes a vigil where several brothers heard bells not rung and saw the crucifix sway in rhythm to chanting. The chronicler admitted confusion, but concluded that the Lord works in mystery. The line between mysticism and intoxication blurred often in such moments. Did the monks fully understand the chemical causes of their visions? Probably not, but they had enough experience to respect the effects. Older brothers passed on brewing, lore with warnings. Too much mugwort is a curse. One note reads, but a breath of it will help you see through fear. The wisdom was layered, not scientific, but observant. They knew how much herb tipped the balance from spiritual joy into chaos. Outside the monastery, things were more chaotic. Lay brewers, who lacked the resources and training of monks, experimented more recklessly. Some Groot ales sold in markets were dangerously strong, both in alcohol and herbal content. A chronicler in York wrote of a beer that stole men's memories, and another that caused a farmer to dance for 2 days. These exaggerations aside, municipal records show periodic bans on certain herbs in brewing. Civic leaders, unlike the cloistered monks, were less inclined to call hallucinations divine, and more likely to call them disruptive. Meanwhile, women brewers' alewives became common across towns and villages. Many of these women had learned herbal brewing from mothers and grandmothers. Some knew how to adjust flavor and potency. A few, accused of using bewitched beer, were dragged before courts, especially when customers claimed to see demons or angels after a heavy session. What was controlled curiosity in monasteries became social danger in taverns. The tension grew as brewing knowledge spread, and more people began experimenting outside clerical oversight. The church doubled down. Synods debated whether hallucinations were signs of divine contact or evidence of demonic influence. Eventually, most bishops agreed. Any substance that brought visions, without fasting or prayer, was suspect. Thus began a slow suppression. By the late 1400s, Groot brews were increasingly replaced by hopped beer. Herbal ale was no longer the sacred tonic of monks or the dreamy fog of pilgrims. It was framed as pagan, even heretical. The brewing books changed. Recipes became cautious. The old language of spirit wine and fire dream faded into disuse. Yet the memory of those early brews endured in folklore. Songs in the north of England spoke of priest's ale that makes the moon sing. A German children's rhyme warned, "Drink not from Brother Conrad's keg, lest you dance until your shoes are ash." In these echoes, we glimpse the shadow of a lost tradition, not sinful or wild, but complex. A practice that sat between survival and celebration, between chemistry and faith. So as the medieval world inched toward modernity, monks and brewers alike faced the same question in different forms. When the brew lifts the mind to heaven, is it holiness, or simply herb and happenstance? By the 16th century, the rich and varied world of mind-altering medieval brewing was nearing its quiet conclusion. The sacred balance of herb, grain, and spirit, once carefully preserved by monks and whispered between alewives, was unraveling under the weight of religious reform, political regulation, and emerging science. What was once common Groot beer, wormwood wine, even celebratory ales laced with mild hallucinogens, was being replaced by something cleaner, more uniform, and, perhaps, a little duller. The Protestant Reformation dealt the first real blow. Across much of Northern Europe, monastic institutions were closed or stripped of their economic power. Their breweries, once the pride of abbey lands, were seized, sold, or destroyed. Without the guiding hand of the monks, who had both the knowledge and discipline to manage psychoactive ingredients, many brewing traditions vanished or were simplified into safer forms. Even in Catholic regions, stricter ecclesiastical scrutiny fell on anything that might suggest visions or altered states as a pathway to God. Theologically, too, the atmosphere shifted. Whereas medieval mystics could write of visions and sensory detail and still be canonized, the post-medieval church became more cautious. The idea that divine insight could be accessed through fermented roots or strong drink began to look more like blasphemy than devotion. In this atmosphere, psychoactive brewing fell deeper into suspicion. At the same time, hops rose from a marginal flavoring agent to the standard bearer of brewing purity. They had begun their steady ascent centuries earlier, especially in the Low Countries and parts of Germany, but now their status was codified in law and custom. Hops were not only a natural preservative keeping beer from souring, but their mild sedative properties were viewed as beneficial. Hopped beer dulled the nerves, soothed the stomach, and produced none of the unpredictable side effects seen with mugwort, henbane, or wormwood. And it wasn't just a matter of church and chemistry. Economics played a role. Hopped beer could be brewed in larger batches, shipped longer distances, and sold more reliably. As towns grew and trade networks expanded, a standardized product made more sense. Local herbal brews were replaced by predictable, hop-forward ales. Brewers who clung to the old ways found themselves pushed aside, their recipes dismissed as rustic, or worse, dangerous. Still, some traditions endured, especially in the far edges of Europe. In remote valleys of the Alps, villagers continued to brew with wild herbs well into the 17th century. In Iceland, farmhouse ales flavored with angelica root and Arctic thyme remained popular, especially during festivals. In parts of Finland, Sautian old-style brew, made with juniper, attained its earthy, intoxicating strength. But these were cultural holdouts, fading echoes of a more diverse brewing past. Medical science, too, contributed to the shift, as apothecaries became physicians, and physicians became tied to universities. Herbal brewing lost its footing as a form of folk or monastic medicine. The herbs once slipped into ale for their spiritual or euphoric effects were now categorized as toxins. Henbane was labeled poisonous, mandrake dangerous, wormwood suspect. The goal of medicine became precision, not mysticism. The body was studied, not the soul. And beer, once a liquid that could awaken both, became a beverage for thirst, not for revelation. But while the brews changed, the memories persisted. In old tavern songs, one can still hear the ghosts of those early ales. Black ale of the friar, bold as midnight, sings a Yorkshire tune from the 1500s. In Scandinavian tales, dream ale still causes heroes to see the future or speak to animals. Even some early modern plays reference fool's beer, a drink that makes men dance, speak nonsense, or fall in love with shadows. There's something poignant in how this chapter of brewing history ended, not with scandal or violence, but with silence and substitution. The most mind-altering brews were not banned in great declarations. They were simply replaced. The loss was gradual, as safer, more controllable ingredients took over, and in doing so, something older, stranger, and more human was forgotten. For centuries, people across Europe, monks, brewers, farmers, and pilgrims had drunk ale that could do more than cheer the heart. It could stir visions, soften grief, open pathways to the divine or the delusional. The line between intoxication and insight was never clear, but the experience was real and meaningful, shaped not just by the contents of the cup, but by the context in which it was shared. Prayers at twilight, songs at harvest, vigils for the dead. In today's world, we tend to see altered states as a scientific curiosity or a recreational diversion, but for the medieval mind, the brew was part of life's sacred rhythm. A mug of Groot ale was not just refreshment, it was survival, communion, and sometimes transcendence. So what remains of this strange, intoxicating past? A few recipes in crumbling manuscripts, some folk brews, stubbornly preserved in rural corners, and, perhaps, the lingering mystery that lingers at the bottom of every cup. Did those who drank in faith truly touch the divine, or were they simply high on herbs and hope? Imagine sitting in the nave of a towering Romanesque cathedral in the late 12th century. It is dark except for flickering candlelight and beams of sun slicing through narrow windows. The cold stone floor is damp, the air thick with layered, since-melted wax, old wood, and, most overpoweringly, incense. A thurible swings gently from the hands of a slow-moving priest, dispersing thick aromatic smoke into the air with each pass. The sweet, heady perfume fills your nose and lungs, and the deeper you breathe, the more your head begins to swim, not from emotion or piety alone, but from something more material and more ancient. This was the reality for millions across medieval Europe, a spiritual experience delivered not just by sermons or scripture, but also by synthetic, deliberate use of incense and resins, some of which may have carried mild psychoactive or narcotic properties. The liturgical use of smoke wasn't merely symbolic. It was physical, sensory, and, in certain cases, mind-altering. This story begins not in a lab or a tavern, but beneath the vaulted ceilings of a medieval church, where smoke was both an offering and a gateway. Incense has a long, sacred history. In Christian ritual, it symbolized purification and the ascent of prayers to heaven, echoing phrases from Psalms and Revelations. But Christianity did not invent the practice. The tradition of burning fragrant resins traces back through the Jewish temple, through Roman pagan rites, and even further into the Zoroastrian and Egyptian religious traditions. When Christianity adopted incense, it inherited centuries of aromatic experimentation. The most common ingredients used in church incense were frankincense and myrrh, both derived from trees native to the Arabian Peninsula and the Horn of Africa. These substances were valuable, exotic, and traded along long, dangerous routes. They were burned in large quantities during Mass, funerals, high feast days, and especially in the presence of bishops or relics. And while these two resins are not considered psychoactive in the modern sense, recent pharmacological studies have shown that compounds in frankincense, particularly in May, have mild anxiolytic and mood-altering effects when inhaled in concentrated doses. Now consider the medieval setting, a sealed stone church with poor ventilation, hundreds of people packed into pews for hours, the air dense with smoke, the mind softened by rhythmic chant, and the sheer overwhelming sensory environment. It's not hard to imagine how, for some, a sense of elevation, detachment, or spiritual euphoria might have taken hold. These experiences, while attributed to divine presence, may have been chemically supported by the materials used in worship beyond frankincense and myrrh. Medieval incense often contained regional additions, church records, and surviving recipes from monastic scriptoriums list ingredients such as labdanum, storax, benzoin, galbanum, juniper berries, and even cannabis resin in some rare cases. Many of these resins were known to produce relaxing or dreamlike effects, especially when burned in enclosed spaces. Labdanum, for instance, has a deep musky aroma that in high doses can become dizzying. Galbanum was considered pungent and sacred, said to sharpen concentration during prayer. The inclusion of these elements was rarely medical. They were added for scent, for symbolism, and perhaps unintentionally, for effect. Monks and priests believed that certain smells brought the mind closer to God. In the Cluniac tradition, smell was associated with divine beauty and order. In some texts, the odor of sanctity was not a metaphor, it was literal. Saints were described as exuding sweet fragrances, even after death. It is no coincidence that churches sought to recreate these smells in ritual, but sometimes the effect was stronger than expected. Anecdotes survive of worshippers fainting during prolonged vigils, of novices feeling dizzy and euphoric after their first experiences, as thurifiers the ones tasked with burning incense. In the Chronicles of Saint Martial, a 13th century monk notes an Easter service where the air grew so thick with scent and song that I felt lifted beyond my feet. Another, more skeptical entry from a visiting bishop in Italy complains that, too, much gum burned in the chapel makes men giddy and forget their lines. It's tempting to dismiss these as literary flourishes, but when viewed in the context of medieval sensory overload, the lights, the smells, the acoustics, they begin to look like real, measurable phenomena. The human brain, overwhelmed by scent and deprived of fresh air, can easily produce sensations of floating, warmth, detachment, or spiritual insight. Today, such effects are known and studied. Then, they were understood as the Holy Spirit moving through the room. The effect wasn't only for the laity. High-ranking clerics, too, may have experienced altered states during long, incense-heavy ceremonies. These rituals could stretch for hours, often with little food or water, and sometimes in physical discomfort. The combination of fatigue, scent, and repetition created a trance-like atmosphere. Some bishops were described as entering holy silences after such services, speaking little for hours, staring ahead with a strange calm. Whether this was spiritual ecstasy or subtle intoxication remains unclear, but the result was the same, a heightened sense of presence, or absence, from the world. Not all incense was benevolent. Cheap substitutes, or regional variants, sometimes used less refined ingredients, such as burnt animal dung or local weeds, when imported resins were too costly. Some churches in Northern Europe burned mixtures that included hemlock, celandine, or foxglove, not realizing the potential toxicity of the smoke. One case in the diocesan records of Mainz describes a church service where several parishioners experienced nausea and dizziness, later attributed to a corrupted batch of incense that included moldy resin and a local hallucinogenic herb. No formal investigation was made, and the event was simply described as a test from heaven. Even cannabis, though extremely rare, appears in a few incense recipes from obscure sources, particularly from Eastern Europe and the Levant. A fragment from a Georgian Orthodox monastery lists hemp gum among the ingredients used for special feast day incense. While there is no indication of recreational use, and the inclusion may have been accidental or symbolic, it reminds us that the line between sacred and psychoactive was not always sharp, as with sacred herbs in monastic brewing. The key factor in these rituals was intent. The church did not encourage intoxication for its own sake, but when sensory elements, scent, sound, light brought the faithful closer to spiritual experiences, they were accepted, even celebrated. The goal was not escape, but elevation. Not madness, but meaning. And so, within the walls of medieval churches, thousands of souls inhaled sweet smoke, knelt on cold stone, and felt something shift inside. They called it grace. They called it peace. They said the veil between this world and the next had grown thinner, but that leaves a question lingering beneath the arches of every stone cathedral filled with incense and hymn. Did the prayers rise, or did the smoke bring the heavens down to them? As the use of incense became more embedded in the rituals of medieval Europe, so too did the layers of symbolism and secrecy surrounding its preparation. No longer simply a sensory addition to prayer, incense emerged as a bridge between theology and human experience, something that could move the soul through the body, and the body through the soul. But as more clergy began to notice the strange effects it had, not just spiritually, but physically, a quiet unease began to ripple through the church walls. Behind the altar, in the sacristy, was where the incense was stored, usually locked, in small wooden chests lined with linen or tin. Senior priests or monks managed the supply, blending powdered resins with reverence and often secrecy. Recipes were not written down openly. Instead, they were passed verbally or tucked into margins of psalters and breviaries. These mixtures changed from season to season and region to region, but one element was constant: quantity. Unlike the soft wisps used in modern churches, medieval liturgies often filled entire chapels with smoke. The Missa Solemnis, Easter vigils, funerals for nobles all used heavy doses, sometimes swinging censers for 40 minutes straight. In smaller chapels with low ceilings, the results could be intense. By the 14th century, some church leaders had started voicing concerns, not against the use of incense, but about its effects. A series of reports from German dioceses described faintings in the pews during midsummer masses, attributed officially to fasting or emotional intensity, but noted with an undertone of physical reaction. In England, the Bishop of Lincoln warned clergy not to overheat the choir with foreign gums, especially in smaller chapels. And in Florence, where processions included elaborate street-side censing, townspeople reportedly experienced headache, dreamlike steps, and moody visions after walking through the aromatic clouds. The concern wasn't just over fainting or nausea, it was theological. If incense could truly influence the mind and mood, then it raised uncomfortable questions. Was the spiritual transformation people felt in church the result of divine intervention or of substances? Did sacred experience require smoke, scent, and rhythm to truly take root? And if so, could the line between holy and chemical be defended? These questions didn't find easy answers. Most bishops and theologians avoided the topic entirely, choosing instead to reaffirm incense's traditional symbolism. But in quieter corners of abbeys and universities, debate brewed. A minor treatise by a Carthusian scholar from the late 1300s asks, "If the herb brings joy, but not prayer, is it then holy?" He concluded, cautiously, that incense was acceptable only if the joy it brings leads not to laughter, but to AW. Meanwhile, the craft of incense continued to evolve. In the monastic workshops of southern France and northern Spain, monks began blending more complex incense formulas, often based on ancient Roman recipes. These formulas included a broad spectrum of ingredients: resins, crushed seeds, dried petals, and even powdered minerals. Some monasteries grew their own gardens of aromatic plants: sage, sweet flag, lavender, and marjoram. These were not exotic imports, but they had their own subtle effects. Sweet flag root, in particular, was believed to enhance focus and calm. Trembling hands a benefit for monks preparing for long vigils. Some scholars argue that the inclusion of these calming agents was intentional. Monastic life, after all, was built on long hours of repetition, stillness, and inner focus. Anything that could quiet the nerves and steady the mind was welcome, especially if it carried the aroma of holiness. Inhaling the incense became a kind of passive meditation, a quiet descent into concentration. Even more intriguing are records from Eastern Orthodox churches, where incense use followed different traditions. In the Georgian and Armenian churches, particularly those in high-altitude monasteries, the blends were sometimes stronger and more resinous. One account from a 14th-century Georgian monk describes incense as smoke that opens memory and binds the mouth in awe. Whether this was poetic language or a literal observation is unclear, but the language reflects how incense was perceived as a vessel of both mental and spiritual transformation. Laypeople, too, internalized the importance of scent. In many villages, it was common to take ash from the thurible after Mass and mix it into water for blessings. Some farmers would hang the remnants of burned incense in their fields to protect crops. A few even inhaled leftover ash smoke during illness, believing it brought peace and protection. Whether the benefits were psychological, spiritual, or mildly chemical is beside the point. The belief was real, and in many cases, it worked. But for every account of peace or focus, there were stories of disorientation. In a 15th century convent near Bruges, nuns reported strange dreams after prolonged exposure to certain incense during nocturnal services. One sister described a dream of walking through walls, another of a flame that sang psalms. The prioress, concerned, consulted with local clergy, who advised switching back to the older blend of frankincense alone. The dreams ceased, or so the records say. Perhaps the most telling story comes from an anonymous letter preserved in a Dominican archive in Avignon. The writer, a young novice, describes his first Holy Week service. As the bells rang and the smoke thickened, I no longer felt the stone beneath me. The hymns moved like waves. My breath slowed. I thought I was dying, or that I had died already, but I wept, and I was not afraid. I believe God was there, but I also believe something else opened my heart first. He never names incense directly, but the implication is clear. What this suggests is a world where people did not clearly distinguish between the spiritual and the sensory. Scent, sound, and light were not distractions from faith, they were its delivery system. The experience of church was immersive, overwhelming, and transformative, and incense, for all its theological baggage, was a key that opened doors not easily closed. As Reformation pressures grew and Protestant movements rejected much of Catholic ritual, incense fell out of favor in many regions. Luther himself was cautious about its use, and later reformers outright banned it as popish theater. Churches stripped their sanctuaries of smoke, scent, and splendor. Services became austere. The air cleared, but for many, something sacred was lost. And yet incense never disappeared entirely. It survived in Catholic strongholds, in Eastern Orthodoxy, and later in High Church Anglicanism. Today, it is still used in cathedrals and chapels around the world, though often in gentler quantities and with greater ventilation. The thick, mysterious clouds of the medieval liturgy are mostly gone. What remains is a soft echo just enough to remind worshippers that prayer once had a smell, and perhaps still should. But if you ever find yourself in an old stone church, where the smoke rises in curling tendrils and the music floats like mist above the altar, ask yourself, is the holiness you feel carried by your soul or simply riding the smoke that curls through the rafters? By the late Middle Ages, the golden age of incense had begun to fade. Not because its effects were fully understood, but because the world that had made those effects feel sacred was shifting. As new theological ideologies spread across Europe and the material sciences crept into the Church's once exclusive dominion over perception, incense found itself recast not as a spiritual tool, but as an object of superstition, wastefulness, or even danger. The Protestant Reformation hastened this decline. Reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin rejected much of the medieval sensory architecture of worship statues, relics, choirs, vestments, and incense alike. For them, the path to God was through scripture and reason, not smoke and sensation. Calvin went further than Luther, calling incense a vain affectation that distracted believers from the word. As churches across northern Europe were stripped bare, the thuribles were packed away, and the fragrant recipes were lost or destroyed. In these new churches, light streamed unbroken across wooden floors. The air was clear, cold, and quiet. For many, this was clarity. For others, it was emptiness. Still, in Catholic Europe and parts of the Orthodox world, incense endured. Yet even here, the ritualistic fervor began to give way to more restrained use. Liturgical reform in the Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, codified much about church practice, but incense was treated more cautiously than before. The amount used was reduced in some orders, and the ingredients more tightly standardized. Gone were the curious regional additions galbanum, sweet flag mugwort, or anything that might be too stimulating. A return to frankincense and myrrh, and their mild, manageable effects, became the norm. Some of this change was also influenced by growing knowledge of medicine and chemistry. Apothecaries began studying the ingredients once used freely in incense, and noting their properties. Labdanum was discovered to have narcotic potential. Storax could cause headaches in confined spaces. Even the faintly psychoactive incensyl acetate in frankincense became an object of study not for spiritual use, but for understanding the physical mind. Where monks once burned these substances to open the heavens, early modern physicians measured them to understand the nervous system. The transformation was quiet but final. Churches that once rang with song and swirled with smoke became more architectural than experiential. The senses, once gateways to God, were now risks to be managed. The idea that you might feel holiness because of how your body reacted to incense was viewed with increasing suspicion. Worship became an act of discipline, not immersion, and yet not everything vanished. In some southern European churches, particularly in Spain, Portugal, and parts of Italy, old traditions clung stubbornly to life. Holy Week processions in Seville filled narrow streets with incense so thick that visibility dropped. In rural Croatian churches, Frankincense was still mixed with dried herbs collected from the hills sage thyme, even traces of wormwood, and in certain Orthodox rites, particularly in Armenia and Georgia, the original heavy sensings never truly disappeared. The ritual remained saturated by scent, by symbolism, and perhaps by subtle chemical influence. Curiously, the modern world has begun to return to these forgotten intersections of spirit and substance. In recent decades, researchers in psychology and religious studies have begun exploring how scent, light, and rhythm affect brain chemistry. Studies have shown that burning frankincense can reduce anxiety and trigger mild alterations in consciousness, similar to meditation. Others have explored how chanted ritual combined with olfactory stimulation can create states of intense focus, even mild dissociation. What medieval monks experienced may not have been magic, but it also was not imaginary. And with the return of interest in aromatherapy, sacred plants, and sensory design in architecture, new generations are re-examining what was once discarded in some high church liturgies today, especially in Anglican cathedrals or certain Jesuit communities. Incense has regained symbolic weight, but it is used with awareness. Gone is the unmeasured burning of clouds. Now, a few pinches are added, a gentle waft, enough to suggest mystery without overwhelming the lungs. Still, for those who have stood in one of the few remaining medieval churches that practice full sensings where the choir echoes, the bells ring, and the smoke thickens with every swing of the thurible, the sensation is unforgettable. The mind slows, the eyes lose focus. The scent becomes not just a smell, but a presence. In that moment, whether believer or skeptic, one might begin to understand why generations believed that incense could carry prayers to heaven, or bring heaven closer to earth. There is one final detail worth remembering. In medieval funerals, the thurible was often swung over the open grave, and incense scattered across the coffin. It was said to mask the scent of death, but also to bless the body, purify the soul, and guide it through the veil. The smoke, rising into the sky, was seen as a final offering. Not just a symbol, but a substance moving through air, through lungs, through spirit. Today, the body is embalmed, the church is sealed, the air is filtered, the prayers are whispered, over-polished. There is no smoke, but somewhere deep in the stone memory of the old cathedrals, and in the lungs of monks long past, the scent remains, invisible, unresolved, sacred. And it leaves behind one final question. Was it ever the incense that made us believe? Or was belief simply what we inhaled with every breath of sacred smoke? In the dusty margins of medieval herbal manuscripts, those laboriously copied tomes, filled with lists of remedies and illustrations of curious plants, you will occasionally find faint warnings inked in red. Do not take in heat, 'cause of visions, deadly if mismeasured. These annotations were not idle superstitions, but the inherited caution of generations who knew that certain roots and leaves could change the body and bend the mind. They were the tools of healers, the accusations of inquisitors, and in many cases, the quiet allies of women who lived on the edges of law and legend. The medieval world had no single definition for a witch. Some were midwives, others herbalists, others merely women whose knowledge exceeded what was expected. But many of the plants later associated with witchcraft were, for centuries, part of common rural medicine. The difference came down to context and, often, to fear. And at the center of that tangled web of medicine, mysticism, and accusation stood three infamous plants: mandrake, henbane, and nightshade. Let us begin with mandrake, perhaps the most storied of them all. Its thick, forked root often resembles the rough outline of a human figure: two legs, sometimes a twisted arm, a bulbous head. Ancient texts claimed it screamed when pulled from the earth, a shriek so terrible it killed anyone who heard it. Pliny the Elder wrote of it. So did the authors of the Talmud. By the medieval period, that belief had evolved into a ritual. Tie the root to a black dog, cover your ears, and let the dog do the pulling. Whether or not this was ever truly practiced is unknown, but the legend endured. Once harvested, mandrake's danger shifted from folklore to pharmacology. The root contains alkaloids that, in small doses, can cause sleep, numbness, or euphoria. In larger amounts, they bring confusion, hallucinations, and even coma. It was used in early anesthesia. Arab physicians and Jewish healers wrote of its ability to dull pain during operations, but it was also used in more ambiguous ways. A folk recipe in Provence described a dreaming tea made from mandrake steeped in wine and taken before bed. A manuscript in northern Italy, later confiscated during a witch trial, included instructions for using grated mandrake to loosen the tongue of the unwilling. The second of these powerful herbs was henbane, a plant with pale yellow flowers marked by dark veins. It exuded a sharp, nauseating smell. Henbane was widely known among healers and heretics alike. It grew in ditches, near graveyards, and sometimes on the ruins of old temples, always in places considered spiritually thin or dangerous. Medieval herbals were both fascinated and terrified by it. It could treat toothaches, coughs, and pain, but take too much, and the world unraveled. The effects of henbane are well documented: dry mouth, blurry vision, dizziness, and vivid hallucinations. In some cases, it caused fits or violent spasms, and yet it remained a staple in many healing gardens. Its unpredictability made it both powerful and perilous. A Saxon herbal from the 10th century warns, best given to oxen. Men must beware. For those accused of witchcraft, possession of henbane was damning. Court records from German and Swiss inquisitions listed among forbidden items. A woman found with dried henbane in her satchel might be accused of brewing flying ointments or summoning spirits. Ironically, many of those accused were likely innocent or, at least, unaware of the full powers of the plant they carried. And finally, deadly nightshade, also known as belladonna. The name beautiful lady came later, but the plant's reputation for danger was ancient. Its shiny black berries, sweet to taste, were known to kill children who mistook them for fruit. Yet, in skilled hands, the plant was valuable. Physicians used its extract to dilate the pupils during eye surgery. Healers used its leaves to soothe muscle spasms, and in more secretive circles, its properties were harnessed to produce sensations of flight. Belladonna, like henbane and mandrake, belongs to the Solanaceae family, a group of plants that, while containing some of the world's most nourishing food, like potatoes and tomatoes, also includes its deadliest drugs. These three herbs contain tropane alkaloids, chemical compounds that interfere with the nervous system, particularly by blocking neurotransmitters. The result: time stretches, the world tilts, shapes blur, you no longer feel your limbs, and in high doses, the experience mimics what some medieval sources called night rides or spirit walks. These are the same effects that later generations would associate with flying ointments, salves supposedly rubbed on broomsticks, or the body that allowed witches to soar through the night sky. While there is no evidence of actual flight, the recipe for such ointments included ingredients remarkably similar to those used in medical sedatives. Grated mandrake, crushed henbane, and belladonna were common, mixed into fat or oil, and applied to the skin. The absorption of these chemicals through mucous membranes could indeed produce an out-of-body sensation. That some of these salves were applied to the thighs or armpit areas, where skin is thin and absorption fast, only adds credence to the pharmacological theory behind the legend. It's important to understand that these herbs weren't used solely for pleasure or illusion. Most women accused of using them did so for practical purposes: easing pain in childbirth, numbing wounds, treating insomnia, or calming fits. But when healing looked too much like magic, and especially when the patient spoke of strange dreams, Visions the healer was accused, not of skill, but of sorcery. Men used these herbs too, of course. Alchemists, monks, traveling doctors. But women bore the brunt of suspicion. A widow in a village might know how to ease fevers with a poultice, made from wild roots. But if the fever broke too quickly, or if the dreams that followed were too strange, neighbors might whisper. If a storm came unexpectedly, or a cow died, the whispers might turn to accusations. A bag of dried herbs, once a mark of healing, became evidence. So where did this knowledge come from? Most likely it came through generations of oral teaching. Mothers teaching daughters, midwives mentoring apprentices. Some of it may have come from classical sources, Dioscorides, Galen, or Arab physicians like Avicenna, but much of it was local, tested through experience, adjusted over time. Still, the recipes were not always stable. Dosage was difficult to control. One root might be twice as strong as another, depending on the season, the soil, or the moon phase. A tea that soothed one person might send another into wild delirium. As fear of witchcraft grew in the late medieval period, this unpredictability was viewed not as natural variation, but as evidence of dark intentions. And yet the herbs remained. They grew in hedges, graveyards, gardens, and gallows hills. They appeared in folk songs, carvings, and court testimonies. They were, for many, the only medicine available. To use them was a gamble. To understand them was a power. And to possess them was a risk. But the deepest question lingers still. Were these plants feared because they worked or because they revealed truths that others preferred remain hidden? As the 15th century progressed and the winds of fear began to swirl through rural Europe, the knowledge of certain herbs once passed quietly from hand to hand in village cottages or whispered between midwives under the low beams of cold. Kitchens became the very foundation upon which suspicion was built. In an age where suffering had no consistent explanation, and illness often moved like a curse, those who could ease pain or bring on sleep were eyed with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. But as years passed and Europe darkened with the smoke of superstition, this uncertainty turned to accusation. The women who knew the roots beneath the hedges and the leaves that numbed the body soon found themselves painted not as healers, but as witches. Among the oldest women of the forest edge, or the town outskirts, it was not uncommon to tend gardens with unusual plants. A widow might grow henbane behind her home to treat toothaches, or keep a patch of belladonna in a stone ring for menstrual cramping. Mandrake, if one was fortunate enough to have it, was treated as both blessing and burden, used sparingly, and only after the right prayers or moon cycle. The recipes were not written, they were lived. A pinch of root grated into cider for the man who hadn't slept in 3 nights. A leaf crushed with honey to calm a shrieking child. Most times, the dose helped, but other times, the pain dulled too quickly, or the dreams that followed were too strange, and the villagers began to murmur it. Was in these moments, when healing blurred with mystery, that a new kind of fear took hold. A woman whose tincture brought a man from the edge of fever might be lauded in one season, and accused in the next, if his dreams were filled with spirits. A laboring mother who delivered safely after drinking a root-steeped brew might bless the midwife with her first breath, only for neighbors to claim later that the child bore a mark of the devil. And it was in these tangled moments of misunderstanding, where pain ended too easily, or visions came uninvited, that the shadow of witchcraft began to stretch. In small villages across the Alps, the Pyrenees, and the forests of central Germany, the authorities came knocking, not always with fire, not yet, but with questions. Who gave you this root? Where did you learn to mix these leaves? Why does your brew cause dreams? The women who answered had little defense, for their knowledge was neither sacred nor scientific. It was instinct and memory, passed through hands, not books. One woman in the Tyrol region confessed, under the weight of fear and the heat of iron, that she had made a salve from pig fat, mandrake, and belladonna, and rubbed it into her thighs. She said she dreamed of flying. Her confession became a template, and suddenly, across Europe, the stories of ointments and flight began to appear. The ointments were simple, by modern standards, though their effects were anything but. Crushed mandrake, root for heaviness, henbane for detachment, belladonna for the strange flickering of space and time. Mixed with animal fat, goose or bortha salves were smeared on the skin in hidden places. Some were used to treat pain, others to induce sleep, and a few, perhaps, were made with curiosity. The result was often a trance, or what we would now call hallucination. Time fell away. The walls of the room softened. The user felt her body light, and the sky opened. She might dream she was riding through the clouds, or walking among trees that spoke in the voices of ancestors. And when she awoke, cold, shaken, confused, she might remember only fragments. She might whisper them aloud, and someone might. Over here, the church had no framework for these experiences. Visions in a cloister were divine. Visions in a cottage were dangerous. When a monk described a dream after a fast, he was a mystic. When a woman described one after touching a bomb, she was a witch. And so, slowly, the ingredients of healing became evidence. A pouch of dried henbane, once medicine, was now a mark of heresy. A root carved to resemble a man, once kept for its charm, was now a demon's doll. A salve, once used to ease joint pain in winter, was now an unholy oil. Inquisitors were taught to look for signs. They were told to ask about ointments, to question the presence of nightshade, to record any mention of flying dreams. They rarely asked how the herbs worked, or why they were used, only whether they had been used. The knowledge passed from grandmother to granddaughter, built on decades of tending sick neighbors, began to die in the silence of fear. And yet even then, some clung to their roots literally and figuratively. A healer in Lorraine wrapped her mandrake in linen and buried it in consecrated earth to keep it from prying eyes. A widow near Ghent gave her salves to the poor only at night, refusing payment, hoping that anonymity would protect her. In the woods of Bohemia, a mother passed her garden to her daughter with only one lesson: never give too much, and never say what the root is called. What they knew, what so many had known for centuries, was that healing was never pure. It was a negotiation with the wild, with risk, with unseen forces. The same root that could bring sleep might, in a heavier hand, bring confusion. And confusion was dangerous, because those who watched from outside did not know where pain ended, and sorcery began. And so the question grew larger than a pouch of herbs, or the leaves on a shelf. It became a question of power. Who was allowed to bring comfort? Who was allowed to touch the edge of the mind? Who was trusted to mix what might change how a person dreamed? Those who had no titles, no parchments, no cloister walls to hide behind, those were the ones asked to explain what could not be explained. And their answers, once passed in quiet wisdom from door to door, became the whispers that filled courtrooms. And behind it all, behind every confession and accusation, every fire and gallows, remained the roots, still growing in the earth, still known by those who remembered what they had once meant. But as the fear deepened and the questions grew sharper, one quiet question remained. Was it the herb that made the dream, or the world that refused to understand it? By the 16th century, the fires had spread, from Scotland's glens to the forests of Bavaria, from the Pyrenean foothills to the misted marshes of East Anglia. The hunt for witches turned not only toward the stars or the devil's mark, but toward the contents of earthen bowls and garden plots. It was no longer enough to be suspected, to be found in possession of mandrake root, to have a dried bundle of henbane hanging in your eaves, or to carry a satchel that smelled faintly of belladonna was enough to bring suspicion down like a hammer. The fear had become institutional. Manuals written for inquisitors, such as the Directorium Inquisitorum, and later the infamous Malleus Maleficorum, listed herbs by name, They warned not only of unguents and salves, but of natural substances used for unnatural purposes. Mandrake was said to contain a demon in its root. Henbane, when burned, was thought to summon storms. Belladonna was accused of pulling spirits into the body. These were not just plants now, they were proof, living and wilting, of alliance with Satan. In the village squares and behind the heavy doors of stone cellars, women were asked to explain what they had grown and why. Some tried to tell the truth, that they used henbane to ease childbirth pains, or rubbed boiled nightshade leaves on a sick neighbor's joints to soothe the ache. But those words, spoken under torchlight, echoed back as confession. They were rarely believed, and often not allowed to finish. The herbs were displayed in court as damning, evidence bundles lifted before the crowd like the weapons of the condemned. In some regions, herbs were burned publicly along with the women who had gathered them. In others, they were locked in chests, by the authorities collected and catalogued, though no one dared use them. A strange paradox emerged. The very same plants, when used by licensed male physicians or monastic herbalists, remained part of legitimate medicine. Belladonna still found its way into sedatives, mandrake into surgical preparations. But in the hands of those without status, they became forbidden. The same leaves, the same roots only. The hands that held them changed the law, and so the knowledge was driven underground. The few who survived the purges, or lived in lands beyond the reach of inquisitors, began to forget the finer details. Recipes were simplified. Doses became uncertain. What had once been a precise, cautious tradition passed through generations became rumor and fragment. In some places, the names of the herbs were changed. Mandrake became sleepman's bone, or widow's doll. Henbane was called crossweed, and belladonna was simply the black gift. The secrecy was a shield, but it came at a cost. Yet even as the organized hunts faded, the reputation of these plants remained. In 17th century folk tales, a woman who healed too quickly, or whose herbs worked too well, was still described as suspicious. Children were warned not to touch plants with five-pointed leaves. Even in Enlightenment salons, where science and medicine were advancing, there was hesitation to speak too openly of the old herbs. They were seen as dangerous relics, reminders of a time when the line between poison and cure, between dream and crime, had been drawn not by knowledge, but by fear. And still, the plants grew. Mandrake, with its forked root and slow rise from the soil, remained rare, but not extinct. In some mountain gardens of southern Italy, the plant was still cultivated quietly, often under another name. Henbane seated itself in graveyards and along ruined walls, sprouting yellow flowers that curled inwards like secrets. Belladonna bloomed in the shadows of oak forests, its berries glossy, its poison undiminished. Modern pharmacology eventually reclaimed what had been cast aside. By the late 19th century, alkaloids from these plants, scopolamine, atropine, and hyoscyamine, were isolated, studied, and refined, used in anesthetics and antispasmodics, even in motion sickness drugs. Their power was finally acknowledged, but now it wore a white coat and held a medical license. The witch's salve had become a doctor's tool. The old recipes had become formulas, and the dream-induced flight of a healer in 1450 became, by 1900, a sedated patient on an operating table. And yet, something was lost in the transition. The plants had once been part of ritual, of story, of intuition. They had been gathered by moonlight not for drama, but because tradition held that their strength peaked then. They had been dried above hearths not to conjure demons, but because the smoke of the fire kept their potency strong. Their use had always walked a narrow path not of wickedness, but of risk, and for those who walked it with care, the reward was relief, and sometimes vision. Today, mandrake is studied in greenhouses, its roots dissected and preserved in clear jars. Henbane is classified as a toxic plant in most regions, its cultivation discouraged, Belladonna is still used in medicine, but behind glass and under control. Few people touch these plants with bare hands anymore. Fewer still remember how to use them without harm, but the echoes remain in folk songs, in superstitions, in the black and white woodcuts of grim women with herbs in their aprons. The fear has faded, the fires are out, but the memory clings like the bitter scent of dried leaves in a dark cupboard, and so we ask, in the quiet that follows centuries of misunderstanding, was the poison in the plant, or in the way the world refused to let its knowledge live? In the vast halls of medieval medicine and mysticism, few traditions remain as faint and curious as the act of placing something directly beneath the nose, inhaling deeply, and calling it divine. Long before the rise of tobacco in Europe, and long before powdered snuff lined the pockets of aristocrats, there were resins, crushed herbs, and sacred dusts that carried strange powers, not just in medicine, but in memory, and perhaps in momentary escape. These were not common substances, and their use was not widespread, but where they did appear, they lingered on the threshold between spiritual devotion and something far more intoxicating. In the monasteries of southern Italy and the Levant, and in scattered apothecaries from Cairo to Cologne, there is evidence, and often folded into marginal notes, of powders kept in small containers, sometimes carved from ivory or bone, stored in drawers beside oils and tisanes. These powders were not consumed as medicine through the mouth, but sniffed, drawn in through the nose, believed to act upon the mind more quickly and with greater clarity. The practice was not yet recreational. It was focused, purposeful, and most often linked to ritual clarity, prayer, preparation, or the easing of melancholic thoughts. Among the most favored substances was mastic, a resin gathered from the Pistachia lentiscus tree, found primarily on the Greek island of Chios. When dried and powdered, mastic released a subtle, clean fragrance. Monks wrote that it refreshed the head and steadied the tongue. Combined with a drop of rosewater and gently inhaled, it was believed to clear the mind before long scripture readings or during early morning vigils. In certain Benedictine communities, the mastic was mixed with crushed bay leaf or fennel to create a more fragrant dust, which could be gently tapped onto, linen and lifted to the nose like a sacred sachet. But it wasn't only monks who engaged in such rituals. Physicians in Moorish Spain described inhalable remedies that traveled not just through scent, but through fine particles designed to enter the brain by way of the nose. A common prescription for melancholy, what we might now call a powdered mix of cardamom, saffron, clove, and camphor, to be placed in a small fabric pouch and sniffed several times daily. In some cases, it was used to prevent fainting or revive the senses. But there are reports, albeit few, of patients who became strangely still, quiet, even euphoric after repeated use. More curious still was the use of benzoin, a sweet-smelling resin from Sumatra, brought to Europe through Arab traders, though more often burned. Certain texts advise grinding benzoin finely and inhaling a pinch to treat wandering thoughts or ghosts of memory. Some described vivid dreams afterward. Others wrote of a heaviness in the limbs followed by calm, as if the powder lulled the body while sharpening the mind. The overlap between medicine and mysticism was never clearer than in these small acts. Inhaling powders, or resins, before prayer was believed to lift the thoughts upward. Among the Desert Fathers, early Christian hermits and monks, there are scattered mentions of placing crushed myrrh under the nose while meditating in caves. It is not known whether this was symbolic or pharmacological, but the language used, the heart left the ribs. The vision cleared and I saw the latter suggests more than simple aroma. There are also darker accounts. A monk in a Polish priory wrote of a mad dust, said to come from the east, made of unknown ingredients, and stored in a greenhorn box. He claimed that a single sniff caused him to see colors and hear music even in the stillness of the chapel. He feared he had sinned. The dust was later buried beneath the cloister floor, in a handful of ecclesiastical trials less dramatic than the witch hunts, but equally revealing certain. Powders found in the belongings of wandering friars or hedge priests were treated as suspicious. One inquisitor in Avignon confiscated a pouch of mixed ash and dried herbs, accusing the owner of attempting to summon visions during prayer. The friar insisted it was a calming dust for long travels, but he was stripped of his post. Whether the powder was psychoactive or merely misunderstood remains unknown. These incidents were rare, but they show something important. The idea of inhalation as a path to altered states was not foreign to the medieval world. While oral remedies dominated, the nose was understood as a direct route to the brain. Some believed the soul entered and exited through breath. To breathe in a sacred substance was, in a sense, to take it into the soul itself. There is no evidence of large-scale use of psychoactive powders in medieval Europe, not in the modern sense. But the seeds of the idea were there. The slow, careful inhalation of crushed herbs. The belief that scent could guide the mind toward silence or insight. The observations of strange dreams or lifted thoughts. These all suggest that the act of snuffing wasn't merely about waking the senses. It was about changing the experience of being, and so, among candles and dust, beside wood-bound books and rusting keys, there were small jars, bone-white or earth-brown, holding something more than ground leaf or resin. They held a breath of another mood, a whisper of clarity, a chance, however fleeting, to inhale something sacred. But this leaves a question hanging gently in the air. Like the drift of powder from a linen sachet, did these sacred scents draw one closer to God, or simply further from the heavy burden of daily thought? In monasteries where silence held for hours, where the only sound was the rustle of vellum or the slow chant of psalms, the act of drawing in a scented powder was not a loud disruption, but a quiet preparation, just as candles were lit in ink, carefully prepared before scripture was copied or prayers whispered. The slow lifting of a cloth pouch or carved vessel to the nostrils became, for some, a part of sacred rhythm. The inhale was not rushed. It was thoughtful, intentional, a reminder that breath itself was tied to the soul, and the soul could be soothed. The Benedictines and Augustinians, particularly in the warmer climates of Provence and Liguria, wrote, occasionally in their medicinal notes of herbal inhalants, given to those suffering from nocturnal weeping, dull mind, or wilt of the will. Most of these were gently prepared from non-psychoactive herbs, lavender, rosemary, sage. But as trade routes with the East became more established, and resins such as storax, ambergris, and benzoin became available, new combinations emerged. In one preserved notebook from the monastery of Sant Cugat in Catalonia, a monk records a mixture of crushed violet leaf, powdered storax, a trace of nutmeg, and dried marjoram. The powder, he writes, is to be set upon a square cloth and breathed before Vesper recitation. When the world clings too heavily, no claim of divine vision follows, but the recipe itself suggests that those living within the weight of the cloister still longed for a release from mental pressure, for a means of reaching a state where the self could dissolve into the divine. The Rhineland mystics, a group of contemplatives in what is now Western Germany, also left scattered hints of these practices in the writings of Mechthild of Magdeburg, and later Hildegard of Bingen. There are descriptions of holy perfumes and breaths that awaken the heart. While Hildegard herself likely did not use snuffed herbs in any altered state, she recognized that scents could affect the spiritual body. A man is gladdened through the nostrils, she wrote, and in gladness, the soul is more easily lifted. Among the lay people, such practices were rarer, but not unknown, in market towns, particularly along the Rhine and the Loire. Some herbalists sold small packets of reviving dust, usually a simple mix of mint, dried lemon peel, and powdered clove. These were carried in pouches or sewn into garments. Occasionally, more potent blends circulated quietly, especially among midwives and wandering healers. These included small traces of asafoetida or apopanax, resins with powerful, sometimes overwhelming aromas, thought to clear the mind or repel bad spirits. Some mixtures may have been accidental protopsychoactive. A healer might crush too much of a resin with sedative properties, and a user already tired or hungry might feel the world shift slightly, their body grow warm, their thoughts heavy. There was rarely panic. Often it was described later as a sense of being between sleep and waking, or struck still by peace. These were not dramatic visions, no flying or demons or ecstasy, just a subtle turning inward, a pause in the daily grind of cold bread, heavy wool, and unending toil. Yet even these quiet effects invited scrutiny. In 14th century Venice, a physician's apprentice was dismissed from his post for selling dream powder to passing merchants. The mixture, made from crushed nutmeg, dried henbane leaf, and ground saffron, was said to give gentle sleep. When one user claimed he saw his dead wife speak to him in the dream, the church authorities grew nervous. The powder was seized, the man beaten, and the apprentice vanished into history. Whether the effect came from the ingredients or the suggestion, no one could say. But the fear was real, that a simple breath of dust could open doors not meant to be opened. Perhaps the most evocative use of sacred powders came not from inhalation alone, but from ritual breatha, practice seen in the Iberian monastic tradition. Before taking vows, novices were sometimes given a cloth dipped in rosewater, pressed with powdered benzoin or camphor, to hold near their nose during the final silent vigil. The scent was not strong, but persistent. Several novices wrote, in private journals or margin notes, that during those hours they felt removed from flesh, as if floating above my own heart, or neither cold nor tired, but far from the room. There was never any claim that these effects were chemical, at least not in the language of the day, but modern eyes, looking back, see in these descriptions the hints of mild sensory change, likely from scent and suggestion working in tandem. And the question arises again, was it the ritual alone, or the physical inhalation, that created the shift? The overlap of breath, spirit, and transformation was deeply rooted in medieval Christian thought. The Latin word spiritus meant both breath and soul. In Hebrew, ruach carried a similar double meaning. To breathe in was to be alive. To exhale was to return something to God. In this theology, a fragrant powder lifted to the nose was not merely scent, it was part of one's prayer, a movement of the divine into the body. And so the use of sacred dusts was tolerated, so long as it remained quiet, modest, and under the watchful eye of faith. But the line was always thin. Too strong a powder, too vivid a reaction, and suspicion followed. Few were accused. Few were punished, but the practice slowly faded. The powders lost their place to printed words. The air cleared. The breath returned to being merely breath. Still, in the edges of libraries and beneath cathedral floors, the jars remain, some crushed, some sealed, and in them, the memory of a time when the soul was thought to move with a breath, and that breath could carry more than air. But as the jars were sealed and the practice faded, one soft question lingered, unsaid but ever present. Did the sacred truly enter through the nostrils, or was it something already waiting within, stirred only by the dust? By the early 1600s, the soft rustle of linen, sachets, and the faint trace of resin at the bottom of carved jars had begun to vanish from monastic cupboards and healers' baskets alike. What had once been a practice cloaked in stillness, a breath taken before prayer, a powder lifted for clarity, was now fading, not in scandal, but in silence. The powders remained, but their meaning unraveled. They became curiosities, relics, sometimes dismissed as superstition, sometimes feared, more often forgotten. Part of this quiet departure came from the shifting tides of medicine itself. As the late medieval world turned toward more scholastic approaches to the body, The old herbal intuitions were set aside. The rise of humoral theory in formal medical schools redefined how illnesses were understood and treated. Inhalation as a method became unfashionable, seen as too rooted in folk practice. Physicians began favoring measured drafts and purgatives, bloodletting and regimens, over breath and scent at the same time. The church's attitude toward altered states grew increasingly cautious. Mysticism, once loosely tolerated within certain cloisters, became more tightly controlled. Visions were now to be examined, not celebrated. Dreams were tested against doctrine, and practices that might alter perception even subtly, even gently, were now viewed with suspicion. The idea that a friar or nun might feel lifted by scent, that a laywoman might inhale powdered myrrh and report clarity, was no longer embraced as spiritual aid, but questioned as potential indulgence or delusion. Then came the arrival of tobacco, with the first imports from the New World. In the late 15th and early 16th centuries, tobacco swept across Europe, not only as a commercial commodity, but as a new kind of breath-altering experience. Here was a plant whose effects were fast, addictive, and visceral. The slow, reverent inhalation of powdered benzoin or crushed herb seemed pale by comparison to the rush of tobacco smoke, while it too was initially considered medicinal, used for headaches, lung ailments, and melancholia, quickly became social, recreational, and in some quarters, vulgar. Within a generation, the entire act of placing something to the nose had been redefined. No longer a quiet prelude to prayer, it was now the gesture of gamblers, nobles, and courtiers, snuff boxers clicking open in candlelit halls, powders more pungent, laced with mint and rose, and even cocaine in later centuries. What had once been sacred was now spectacle, and so the memory of those earlier powders made from tree sap and garden herbs, prepared not for pleasure but for clarity, began to vanish. In many monasteries, the small bone boxes were tucked away, never refilled. In herbals copied in later centuries, the notes on inhaled remedies were quietly omitted or rewritten as oral potions. The last of the cloth sachets were burned when new priors took office, eager to clean house and bring discipline to what they saw as outdated ways. Only in remote places and mountain convents, or among the old women who still gathered herbs by habit more than instruction, did whispers of the old powders linger. Some carried sachets still, filled with lavender and sage, not for visions, but to keep memories sharp in old age. A few remembered the older recipes, but feared saying them aloud. There were no inquisitions anymore, but the silence remained, inherited, from generations taught to keep breath and ritual private. And yet, the idea never fully died. The belief that what we inhale can shift who we are has persisted in other forms: aromatherapy, incense, ritual smoke, and countless traditions. Even modern psychology has returned to the idea that scent is linked to memory, emotion, even transformation. Scientists now understand that the olfactory nerve is the most direct path from the outside world to the brain, bypassing many of the filters that process sight or sound. The medievals may not have known this, but they felt it. They named it, in their own way. So now, when we find old jars in museum drawers, labeled in Latin with smudged ink: pulvis, rosmarinus, resina bento, herba, claritatis, we're not just looking at obsolete medicine. We're seeing the outline of a practice meant not to cure the body alone, but to lift the soul gently, to provide a breath of space in a crowded, often brutal world. A ritual not of escape, but of pause. There is something dignified in that, something deeply human. In a world where storms came without warning, where plagues arrived with no cure, where labor broke the back and prayers sometimes felt unanswered, the act of inhaling something pleasant, something sacred, was a moment of control, a brief encounter with peace. And now, standing centuries removed, we might ask, did they find God in that breath? Or did they simply find themselves, for the first time, without the noise of the world? There is a quiet thread woven through the long history of medieval courts and palaces, a thread made not of silk or gold, but of pain. Chronic pain, illness, gout, sleeplessness, anxiety, and the long grinding aches of old wounds or inherited weakness. Beneath the glitter of crown and scepter, kings and queens suffered, just as their subjects did, though they had more ways to soften that suffering. And among the most trusted of these ways, tucked into the velvet-lined apothecary chests of royal physicians, was a substance known to nearly every ancient civilization: opium. In the medieval world, opium rarely appeared by name. More often, it was disguised in foreign tongues or cloaked in mixtures striaca, diacodium, laudanum, or simply the cordial. But its source was the same: the dried sap of the opium poppy, Papaver somniferum, harvested in the lands of the eastern Mediterranean and traded slowly, secretly, and with great expense. It moved through Venetian ports, Arab physicians, and Jewish merchants, and where it arrived, it was treated not as a drug, but as a miracle of the earth, dangerous, yes, but precious. By the 12th century, opium preparations were already part of European medical theory, largely through the influence of Arabic medical texts translated in Salerno and Toledo. The writings of Avicenna, whose canon of medicine became standard in many monastic schools, described opium as both an analgesic and a sedative. But it was Andromachus's theriac, a mixture dating back to Roman times, that found its way into the courts of Europe in its most potent form. This thick, dark, spiced paste contained dozens of ingredients: myrrh, cinnamon, cardamom, gingerbut. Always included opium. It was stored in engraved jars, tested by tasters, and doled out by court physicians to soothe everything from battlefield wounds to royal insomnia. We find traces of its use scattered throughout royal correspondence and medical notes. Henry III of England, plagued by chronic digestive complaints and sleep disturbances, was given a syrup made of diacodium, a poppy seed reduction in honey water, milder than pure opium but still sedative. Philip IV of France, known for his headaches and melancholy, reportedly carried with him a carved ivory box filled with a dark paste said to banish the black humors and bring rest. The precise ingredients are unknown, but scholars suspect a blend of opium, nutmeg, and saffron. It is important to understand that these were not indulgences. For kings and queens, whose bodies bore the weight of war, diplomacy, and dangerous childbirth, opiates were medicine taken, not in luxury, but in desperation. A king who could not sleep might make a wrong decision in the morning. A queen in labor, screaming for hours, might die without the relief of some potion that dulled the fire. And so the poppy came, disguised in silver spoons and ceramic bowls, hidden beneath the bitter taste of clove and wine. The effects were often predictable: drowsiness, a loosening of the limbs, a drift away from pain, but not always. Some patients became confused, forgetful, or sickened. There were instances of sleep without waking, especially when theriac was given too freely by a well-meaning doctor. Others experienced what were later described as night terrors, waking visions, cries in the night, strange dreams so vivid they were recorded in royal journals. One note in the court ledger of Charles VI of France mentions the king screaming about wolves inside the walls after being given a heavy cordial during a fit of sleeplessness. Whether the wolves were symbolic, psychological, or hallucinated remains a mystery. There is also the tale of Isabella of Hainaut, wife of Philip II of France, who suffered chronic illness after the birth of her son. A preserved letter from her personal physician describes administering a sleep draught made with poppy milk and honeyed resin. Days later, she was dead. While no one blamed the mixture, the dose may have been stronger than intended. In this era, there were no precise measurements, only instinct, observation, and hope. And yet, for all its risks, the use of opium and its derivatives in the royal courts continued. For a ruler in agony, the promise of even a single night's peace was worth the gamble. Physicians recorded the administration of such remedies carefully, sometimes too carefully, as if defending their own choices. Recipes were guarded, proportions were adjusted, and always, the plant itself, the poppy, was treated with caution. In some gardens, it was grown behind walls. In others, it was hidden among herbs with no label. Among the common folk, opium was rarer. It was expensive, imported, and tightly controlled. But in cities with strong trade, ties Venice, Barcelona, bogus apothecaries sometimes sold diluted extracts, especially to those who could afford a few drops to ease a cough or dull a wound. For peasants and laborers, pain was part of life. But for nobility, pain was something to be tamed, even if it meant walking the edge of poison. It's telling that in many royal tombs, small flasks or jars have been found carefully sealed, often inscribed with nothing more than a symbol. Inside, residue of dried paste, sometimes with traces of poppy alkaloids. They were likely carried to battlefields, stored in bedchambers, or kept at the bedside of the dying. A final comfort, a soft farewell. The deeper tragedy, of course, was that while pain could be eased, it was never fully banished, and the dreams that followed those long drifting nights in royal beds, where kings whispered names and queens cried for children lost, were not always peaceful. Some spoke of fire, others of shadows moving beneath the windows. There are even reports of rulers who refused the drafts after a time, fearing what they saw in sleep more than what they felt in waking, and so the poppy remained beloved and feared. It was planted in royal gardens beside roses. It was powdered in apothecary jars lined with gold. It was praised as a gift from God and whispered about as a gateway to darkness. But as the sun rose each morning over cold stone corridors, the same question lingered at the edge of each royal bed. Was it the pain that haunted them, or the dreams they took to escape it? In the royal courts of medieval Europe, pain was never merely a matter of flesh. It became a question of legacy, of succession, of control. A monarch who limped was a monarch questioned. A queen who winced too long in childbirth risked more than death. She risked being replaced. And so, for those bound to thrones by divine right or delicate diplomacy, pain had to be managed, hidden, or made to vanish beneath the polished surface of composure. This was why the draught, the cup, the vial, the dark cordial became a fixture of royal life, not discussed openly, but always present, always close to the hand or lips. And at the heart of many of these draughts was opium. It came as syrup, as paste, as powder, but its purpose was singular, to soften the sharp edge of life at the top. For all their robes and tapestries, kings bled just the same. Queens labored in blood and breath, and pain, even for the most powerful, could not be willed away. In royal households, the keepers of this pain were the physicians and apothecaries, learned men, trained often in Salerno or Montpellier, who carried with them parchment scrolls, satchels of imported ingredients, and the guarded knowledge of dosages known only to their inner circle. Their most treasured recipe might be theriaca andromachi, a sprawling concoction of 60 or more ingredients, one of which was opium used in amounts guessed more than measured. The compound, originally designed as an antidote to poison, had, by the 13th century, become a favorite sleep aid for the elite. But opium's inclusion was always veiled. Court records rarely mention it by name. Instead, we find entries for the black cordial, the evening syrup, or the draught of stillness. In some cases, it is referred to simply as succorum somni, the juice of sleep. What mattered most was its effect. It allowed monarchs to endure long ceremonies while ill. It dulled the aching joints of aging nobles. And, perhaps most crucially, it granted rest in times when rest seemed impossible. Take Charles V of France, often known as the Wise. Ruling in the late 14th century, he was plagued by chronic headaches and stomach disorders. His physician Guillaume de Chauliac was said to prepare a nightly mixture of powdered poppy latex dissolved in red wine, with a touch of cinnamon and dried fig. Charles claimed it gave him dreams as soft as confession, but after months of use, his writings darkened. He began recording hauntings in sleep, visions of decay, and an inexplicable dread upon waking. Still, he refused to stop the drafts. "The pain is louder than the visions," he once told his confessor. The duality of opium the bomb and the phantom defined its role in court. It granted relief, yes, but also brought something else, a vulnerability, a loosening of the careful mask every ruler wore. Stories circulated of kings who muttered secrets in their half-sleep, or queens who wept uncontrollably after a heavy dose. What was said in those hours often found its way into court rumor. One physician to Queen Joanna of Naples recorded that after a draft intended to quiet her labor pains, she whispered the names of old lovers, whether hallucination or confession. None could say. The dosage, always a gamble, became even more dangerous when pain blurred with power. Some rulers demanded stronger blends, asking their physicians to quiet the storm or silence the wolves, not understanding or not caring that too much could still the heart, not just the nerves. In the court of King Sigismund of Hungary, a servant was dismissed after preparing a sleeping cordial that left the king unconscious for nearly 2 days. No punishment came, only silence, and a quiet tightening of the physician's duties. In more paranoid courts, such mixtures were seen as a potential threat. The fear of poisoning by potion was ever present. Opium, with its bitter taste and slow onset, was an easy tool for those with dark intent. Some monarchs took to keeping tasters even for their sleep drafts. Others demanded the presence of clerics during administration, so that spiritual protection might accompany the chemical. Yet the alternative, medicated pain, was often worse. Edward the Confessor, though predating opium's widespread use in England, is said to have died after days of unrelieved suffering, muttering psalms, and unable to rest. By contrast, his successors embraced imported apothecary goods. In later years, Henry VII reportedly traveled with a poppy chest, locked and handled only by his personal physician, used during gout attacks and nights of political unrest. Still, not every story ends in tragedy. In some courts, opium was respected, but rarely overused. Physicians who balanced caution with knowledge often achieved small miracles: quiet nights, pain-free mornings, dignified public appearances by monarchs who might otherwise have been bedridden. In these cases, the poppy's gift was not ecstasy or madness, but simple control, a chance to live another day with composure intact. Yet the dreams never quite disappeared. Monarchs who used the drafts for weeks or months at a time often reported restless sleep, filled with strange shapes, voices, or mirrors that showed too much. And while these dreams were rarely blamed on the medicine, the patterns were hard to ignore. Opium did not simply erase pen, it carved new corridors through the mind, where memories echoed louder, fears became faces, and sleep held shadows, longer than it should. Some rulers eventually abandoned their drafts. Others increased their dose. The balance was delicate, and always, beneath the silks and jewels, beneath the armor and law, the body ached, and the mind sought escape. And so the question returns, soft as a breath, before sleep: did the kings and queens of old find comfort in the poppy? Or did they wake each morning with more ghosts than before? The later medieval centuries saw an increasing dependence on opiate-based remedies at court, not just as solutions for pain, but as necessities for dignity. As monarchs aged and their bodies betrayed them, the ritual of taking the draft became as familiar as prayerless, an indulgence, and more, a quiet surrender. In these last acts of sovereignty, when kings could no longer ride, or queens no longer rise from bed without assistance, it was often the poppy that helped them pass their final years in peace. And yet, As the line between healing and dependence blurred, so too did the legacy of the herb that once promised blessed rest. In the archives of several royal households, we find a particular pattern emerge in the final years of monarchs and nobles, dosages increasing, entries in ledgers growing vaguer, complaints of fatigue replaced with periods of near silence. The king sleeps longer, the queen is calm, but behind these careful words lies the gradual erasure of presence. The ruler, once commanding, becomes distant. Their decisions are delayed, their speech slows, their gaze softens not with kindness, but with forgetfulness. For some, this was a blessing. Queen Eleanor of Castile, suffering in her final years from a wasting disease, took daily poppy wine prescribed by a Jewish physician known only as Isaac of Burgos. Letters from the court note that she drifted gently, that she was untroubled in thought. She stopped speaking in long phrases. Her attendants described her as smiling often, but rarely at anything in particular. She died in sleep, her last days marked by quiet and by the presence of a small bottle on the table beside her bed. For others, the slow retreat brought anxiety. King Wenceslas IV of Bohemia, tormented by insomnia and deep melancholy, was administered increasingly potent cordials over several years. His advisors began to write of missed meetings, erratic memory, and long spells of stillness in his chambers. Some feared enchantment, others blamed madness. In truth, the king may have simply slipped too deeply into the haze of nightly poppy doses. His dreams were said to be troubled. One servant claimed to hear him speaking to long-dead family members in his sleep. Such dreams were not uncommon. Several noble households kept records of their lord's sleep talk not out of curiosity, but fear. For in those murmured sentences came not just names or nonsense, but secrets, a confession of guilt, a fear of betrayal, a name spoken that should not have been known. Whether these moments were real or imagined, opium opened a door to memory and fear, and there were few who could close it again once the dose had been taken. This is perhaps why some rulers chose to resist, even in agony. Margaret of Anjou, wife to Henry VI, is said to have refused all pain-dulling tonics after the death of her son. "Let me feel the ache," she reportedly said. "It is all I have left of him." Her physicians begged her to accept relief, but she persisted. Her grief was her tether to the world. She did not wish for dreams, only wakefulness. In quieter courts, outside the glare of politics, the use of opium became less ritualized and more personal. Petty nobles and abbots, unburdened by public perception, used the poppy more freely. It was a retreat, a pause, a way to drift beyond the cold stone of duty. Their writings are fewer, but more honest. One monk in Flanders wrote, "I have seen the stars through closed eyes, and spoken with no one. The ache in my leg is gone, but now I cannot feel the bells when they ring." Even the church, which once viewed opium with caution, began to allow its quiet presence in hospice care. In infirmaries, the elderly were sometimes given poppy syrup to ease the passage into death. The doses were small at first, then regular, then heavier. In some abbeys, it became common to recite final prayers beside someone who had already fallen unconscious. The soul was trusted to hear what the ears no longer could, and in this fading, a strange peace emerged. A noble who once shouted in pain now slept. A queen who once trembled in her chair now breathed quietly. The world around them moved on feasts, treaties, crusades, but they drifted. Tethered by the narrow stem of a red flower first planted far from Europe's shores, now rooted in every garden of power. What remains today of these centuries of opiate use is sparse. A few handwritten prescriptions, a handful of dried resin in jars, labeled only with initials. Recipes preserved in herbals, coded in Latin and Greek, their true ingredients tucked behind metaphors, and the residue, perhaps, in our modern imagination where poppies still symbolize sleep, and the line between pain and peace remains impossibly thin. For all their gold, their guards, their gowns, the rulers of medieval Europe found no escape from pain, only management. And even then, the cost was high. The poppy dulled the blade, yes, but it also dulled the voice, the memory, the will. And in their final nights, surrounded by silent attendants and flickering lamps, many closed their eyes, not in triumph, but in the soft forgetting of what they once were. And so we wonder, across centuries of sedated sleep, did the kings and queens of old find mercy in their last draft, or did they slip too soon into a dreamless silence they no longer had the strength to question? In a world without clocks, where days were marked by bells and seasons by harvests, the medieval feast was more than indulgence. It was punctuation, a break in the monotony of labor, a breath between sowing and reaping, fasting and war. Feasts came with births, weddings, treaties, holy days, coronations, and returns from battle. They were loud, luminous, fragrant with roast and spice, and they were absolutely soaked in mead, ale, and honey wine that didn't just gladden the heart but sometimes unmoored the mind. We think of mead now as an archaic drink, something for reenactors and poets. But in the medieval world, it was often the drink of ritual, of status and story. Made from honey, water, and yeast, it was both accessible and sacred. The earliest forms required long fermentation, often in barrels lined with beeswax, and were flavored with herbs and spices, meadow sweet, sage, yarrow, and wild thyme. These additions were not just for taste. Some had mild psychoactive properties, especially in combination with alcohol. Unlike modern liquor, medieval mead was unpredictable. The yeast was wild, the batches inconsistent. A cup might be light and warming, another might be strong enough to numb the hands. Another still might contain enough fermented herb residue to bring on visions, laughter, or tears. And once the feasting began, no one kept count. Cups were passed without measurement, filled and refilled with generous cheer. In these conditions, it wasn't difficult for celebration to tip into confusion. At noble courts, mead was served in metal goblets or carved horns, often laced with saffron or clove to show wealth. At village feasts, it came in pottery jugs, shared communally. The social function of drinking was deeply embedded. To toast was to bind, to refuse was to insult, and so everyone drank. Even the sick were sometimes given warm, honeyed wine as medicine. Children drank watered-down versions during certain festivals. The cup passed hands, and with it, the blurring of the line between community and collective intoxication. In the North Scandinavia, northern Britain, the Baltic states, mead took on even more ceremonial significance. In Icelandic sagas, warriors drink to recall ancestors and summon courage before battle. In Anglo-Saxon England, the mead hall was not just a place to drink, but to speak history, to declare loyalty, and sometimes to challenge enemies. But as the night wore on, and the fire dimmed, the speeches grew slurred, tempers flared. Mead, with its sweet taste and delayed effects, lulled drinkers into lowering their guard till the last cup struck like thunder. One of the earliest warnings comes not from a medical text, but from a monk. The Homilies of Glefric, a 10th century English collection, includes a sermon against drunkenness in which the monk warns that the devil creeps not through the gate, but through the goblet. His concern was not just moral, but practical. Drunkenness led to fights, accidents, even death, and the cause was often not ale, but spiced mead consumed quickly, deceptively sweet, and capable of reducing a soldier or noble to stumbling mutterings in a matter of hours. In the city's guild, feasts became notorious. Records from 13th century Bruges show fines levied against tanners and smiths who brawled after too many bowls of honeyed wine. In Paris, a chronicler described a wedding in which guests began to dance around a fountain and ended the night arguing with statues. These weren't just moments of excess, they were communal descents into altered states. Herbs played their part. Meadowsweet, often used to flavor mead, contains salicylates, compounds related to aspirin and, in larger quantities, can cause dizziness. Yarrow, another common additive, has compounds that may affect the nervous system. While their effects are subtle alone, fermented together and consumed in large quantities, they could produce feelings of euphoria, numbness, or confusion, especially in underfed or fasting guests. Even the church participated. Monasteries brewed their own mead, and clerics drank at feast days. One document from an abbey in the Rhineland recounts a night of hymns, ale, and divine sleep, where several novices reportedly fell asleep mid-song. Whether from the warmth of the room, the strength of the mead, or the herblist brew is unknown. But the rhythm was clear: celebration, song, sleep, or something like it. Sometimes, these effects turn darker. There are scattered accounts of feasts ending not in laughter, but in sudden violence or disarray. A harvest festival in Cornwall reportedly turned chaotic after a vat of strong mead was shared among villagers. Witnesses claimed to see men chasing shadows, shouting about wolves in the fields. A similar tale in a Polish village speaks of guests believing the sun had not risen for 2 days. Whether these are folk tales or distorted truths, they speak to the reputation mead held. Comforting, yes, but not always safe. Even royalty was not spared. King John of England was said to have once dismissed a meeting with his barons because his mind wandered too far in honey. In the Byzantine court, ambassadors from Kiev and Rus were described as drunk for 3 days on golden mead, their negotiations postponed indefinitely. And a letter from a 14th century Castilian noble warns his son: a second cup is for laughter, a third for confusion, a fourth for fools. Despite this, mead remained beloved. It was part of ritual. It was memory in a cup. When guests raised their goblets, they remembered their fathers and grandfathers. They celebrated saints and harvests. They mourned the dead and blessed the living. It was not just alcohol, it was a shared dream, sometimes light, sometimes shadowed. But as we look back across the fog of centuries and the echo of clinking cups, we're left to wonder, did they drink to feel joy? To forget how heavy joy sometimes was to hold? If the first cups of mead were poured in celebration, the later cups often brought something far stranger: a communal surrender to forgetting. The middle and later stages of a medieval feast often dissolved into something that was neither orderly nor sacred, where the boundaries of identity, speech, and behavior shifted, and where memory, too, began to loosen. In this fog of song and sweetness, people often became unrecognizable to themselves. The baker who toasted the bride at dusk might curse his brother by midnight. The steward who distributed dishes in silence might leap upon the tables shouting ancient riddles as the last casks were emptied. It wasn't just the alcohol. It was the way mead, honey-based, herbalaced, slow to rise and slow to fade, and coiled the mind. It helped that medieval feasts rarely ended when full. They ended when the mead was gone, and sometimes it was not gone until deep into the second or third night. Feasts tied to harvests or solstices such as Lammas, Michaelmas, or Midwinter's Eve could last 4 days in noble houses and abbeys. Each day brought a new round of guests, a new set of prayers, and new barrels tapped. The earliest drinking often began at morning prayers, continued through meat and fish courses, and concluded with stewed fruits and sweet wine cordials. But even those who ate little drank freely, and that mattered because drunkenness on an empty stomach brought stranger consequences than any simple stupor. The chronicler Geoffrey of Monmouth, often known for his florid tales, included in his descriptions of the court of King Arthur one peculiar passage where knights are said to have drunk deep from golden horns laced with sage and honey, and sang songs they did not know, and saw visions they would not later recall. Most modern scholars see this as allegorical, but the rhythm of the account matches others found in secular and clerical records alike: mead, herbs, and the loss of self. One notable herbalist in the 13th century, writing under the name Toma of Linz, warned against the brewing of mead,